Let me ask you this. Is the issue chaos? Meaning, is the issue right? Is Lenin right? It takes a certain degree of chaos in order to actually get change. And if that is true, was Donald Trump the best choice for president? Let's get dirty. Let's get dangerous.
Yeah.
Is that, you know?
It's always good to get dangerous because it makes life taste better. You know what I mean? Look, Lenin's point was, and I think it was a wonderful point, that systems continue until two things happen. Number one, the system begins to break down. It can't solve its problems. And number two, that the people who run the system appear to the majority to be unable to fix it, unable to correct the breakdown, to correct it. So let me give you an example. In 2008, global capitalism crashed. We had depression. It lasted at least, depending on how you count, from middle 2007 to 2010. And for many of us, it isn't over yet.
Yeah.
Okay, that's a crash. That's a system that isn't working for millions and millions of people. It was so bad that the big corporations, who love to make fun of the government as being wasteful and inefficient, all those big bankers from New York, all those corporate executives from around the country flew on their private jets to Washington to beg the government to bail them out, which, since it's their government, it did. And they were saved. But the price of it was an austerity for the rest of us, for cutbacks, for cutting back social programs. And the system is breaking down. More and more people see that it isn't working. That's why young people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and the others are getting elected. They don't run away from the label socialist. They're saying this system isn't working and we're going to fix it by changing it. Okay, this is a sign that the system isn't working. So what does the system do? It decides to turn itself over and put itself in the hands of a really ugly, ignorant, nasty fellow, Mr. Trump, and say, we're going to dispense with the niceness. We're going to dispense with the appropriate behavior that for decades, Republicans and Democrats have at least put on for us, even if the reality wasn't so good. They don't have the time for that. They're getting desperate. So they bring in a Mr. Trump whose first act, December of 2017, is a massive tax cut for corporations and the rich, a gift to them of billions and billions of dollars that the government doesn't have. I find this, as a professional economist, unbelievable.
It is
coming at the end of a 30-year period when corporations have done better than they ever did before.
And by the way, just to interrupt you just slightly, the Bloomberg article, he says the conclusion here is, he comes to a conclusion, and this is Bloomberg. The data helps us see that supply-side economics was always about shifting wealth from the low and middle ends of the wealth distribution towards the top.
Right.
In other words, much of the wealth inequality is by design, the result of public policies.
Right. I think the mistake there is, look, even without the design, capitalism does it by itself.
Yeah.
Corporations make money, function to make profit, and they distribute the profit to the shareholders and the top executives. Shareholders and top executives together are a tiny minority of the American people. So if the nature of business is in capitalism is to maximize profit, that's just another way of saying, take it from the mass of people and give it to the rich at the top. The very people who already have it are the ones who get more of it. And what kind of a system is that? Look, if Bloomberg, which is a company owned by one of the billionaires in America, Michael Bloomberg, if they're saying it, you're real sure that that is the case. So the only interesting thing is, why do the mass of people accept this? Why do the mass of people allow it? Why do the mass of people go without the things they need? A college education for their children, a decent job so they can have and raise a family, proper hospital care and medical care, that we can take care of the ailments that nature gives us, or that we're injured through accidents and so forth. Come on, we know what we basically need, and we ought to provide it as a community to one another. Okay. Capitalism is blocking us from doing what we need, and that is the surest sign that it's on its way out, which is why they're scared, and why you have the spectacle of a Trump kind of reverting to the worst examples of how you keep an unfair system going. So he attacks black people, he attacks brown people, he attacks women, he attacks immigrants. Look at him, trying to hold on to a system by not admitting that it's not working for most people, by trying his best to get the working class to fight among themselves, to get the older ones against the younger ones, the white ones against the non-white ones, the men against the women. It's a very old spectacle, but it is uglier than anything, and it never ends well.
It's fascinating to watch this. And two things. Was electing Trump the best choice then, with this notion of creating a certain degree of chaos? I didn't vote for Trump. I voted for Joe Stein. But if the notion that chaos provokes change, meaning you have to have enough chaos around a large distribution of people in order to get that distribution of people to say, all right, no more. This isn't working. I'm done. And as a second point to this, you know, when I was studying Spanish Revolution, Civil War, and you get into this notion of anarchists and communists and fascists, and you have all of these people who want to rip the government apart because they think the government isn't working, like, you know, these different factions. You get to see kind of like in the United States, in almost real terms, how fascism takes hold as a dodge to prevent social change.
Yep.
Like, because it's not magic. It, like, when you're looking over it, you're like, wow, why did those people go that route? And when you're here in the States and you see there's a crash, you see there's socialists that are getting much more airplay and people saying, you know, we need a larger share to the poor. And then you see this buffoon screaming about immigrants running around the country, attacking a 30-something-year-old immigrant for political effect. And you're like, oh, that's why that happens.
Yeah.
You can see it. It's amazing to watch. Like, I mean, it's stunning to watch. Sad to watch in some respects. But
I think, Jamarl, I think it's tragic. I mean, look at this. By most estimates, you have, I don't know, I'll be generous, 10 million undocumented immigrants in the United States. We are a country of 325 million people.
Yeah.
Nothing that 10 million can do, might do, would do, did do is going to majorly affect the other 315 million. This is childishly ignorant to suggest that the immigrants are our problem.
And, you know, to make it even worse, do you realize that half of the companies that are on the top 500 companies, meaning the top 500 companies that are in the United States, almost half, I think it was like 45%, are from immigrants or from people who were immigrants. Think about that. He's attacking. If Donald Trump did what Donald Trump is talking about doing, he would gut either manufacturing or like supply stuff, but he would also gut somewhat of a brain drain, since almost half of those people start businesses.
Not only that, the people who come, if you understand the economics of immigration, most of the people who immigrate are adults. That means their education has already been paid for. They've learned to read, they've learned to write, they've learned all kinds of skills. Those were paid for by the poor countries from which they come. And their mature adult productivity is what they will give to the United States by moving here. That was why the United States grew successfully in the past 100 years, bringing immigrants like Mr. Trump's parents over here with a desire to make it. the idea that by cutting off these immigrants, you're going to change the basic economics of the American people, that's nutty. If you look at what most immigrants do, it's the poorest paid, lousiest jobs in the society.
Yeah.
That's one of the reasons they have an incentive to try to start a business, because they're the ones coming in and they're stuck into the bottom. That's why it is so disgusting that a billionaire takes out his childish rage on some of the poorest people in the society. If you are even half a Christian, how in the world can you live with that or justify that? That's not opening your heart to a stranger. It's not opening your heart to someone less fortunate than you. It's not finding a way for the United States to be what it says on the Statue of Liberty. It is the opposite. It is the behavior of a society falling apart, desperate to hold on to the privileges of the rich, no matter how many of the rest of us you trample on. And I don't think it will survive. I don't think this is going to work. Every other fascism collapsed. The fascism of Italy, the fascism of Germany, these things are now deeply regretted as a terrible stain on those countries' history from which they've had to try to climb out. We are entering and allowing to develop in our country the same ugly breakdown, desperate effort to hold on. You know, the statistics from the demographers indicate that sometime over the next year or two, we will cross the line and the majority of Americans will no longer be white. It's already the case in the school population, elementary school and so on.
Really?
So, yep. And you know, that's what he's playing on. He wants to build his career on the terror and fear of those in the white community, and who are basically driven in many cases by the following deep guilt and fear. Will the non-whites, when they're the majority, treat us the way we treated them? That's their fear. But that's on them. And I think the rest of us have to get together to make sure that they don't act out the self-destructive fascism that we have seen in other countries. And remember, the fascism in Italy and in Germany came after the breakdown of capitalism in those countries.
Yeah.
The 1920s in Italy, in the 1930s in Germany. We've seen another breakdown, and we're now seeing the same ugly monster. Only this time it isn't over there. It's right here.
You know, unfortunately, those countries, it digs into them because they have a cultural experience of it. We don't teach history in that way. We teach history like it happened back then, it never happened here, that type of stuff. Let me ask you this. So, but just be very specific. When you say system, you're talking essentially capitalistic system creating incentives for various people within the system to act a particular way.
Right.
Is that what you mean when you're when you're talking about like pushing fascistic tendencies because they try to hold on to it, and they can't make the argument through policy, so the argument has to be made through, you know, look at that immigrant over there. That immigrant sucks, and you know, let's stop that immigrant.
Right.
Two questions. And
Jamarl, one thing: don't attack. The goal of the fascists is to say the problem isn't capitalism. The problem isn't that you have a small number of people who are executives and members of boards of directors of corporations who make the system work for them. No. That's not the problem. The problem is something completely different. Immigrants, or people with a different skin color, or women, or nasty foreigners who don't trade with us in a fair way. Get people's anger, justified anger, because the system isn't working for them. But get that anger focused anywhere else but on the system. Watch Mr. Trump. This week it's Iranians, next week it's Chinese, next week it's Central American immigrants, next week it's American African Americans, and on and on. He has a list of bad guys. You're supposed to focus on them, be upset by them. just so you don't criticize the system when it is the system that is the problem. Look, capitalism is a system that divides people into a small number who own and operate the businesses of this country and a huge number who work in those businesses. But because the huge number only work in them and the small number own and control them, guess what? The small number, the owners, the shareholders, the big executives, they run the system for them.
Yeah.
They don't run it for us. We're excluded from running the businesses because that's the way they want it. They want it to work for them. That's your fundamental problem. That's why capitalism is the obstacle. If you want an economic system to serve the people, guess what? You got to put the people in charge. We never have a system that serves the people because we allow a tiny minority to be the owners of the bulk of shares. 10% of the people own 84% of shares of stock. Okay, if you allow a tiny minority to own the shares and you allow a tiny minority of people to sit on the boards of directors, I'll give you an example. General Motors employs, I don't know, 200,000 people. The board of directors is about 18, 19 people. You get the point? A tiny group makes all the decisions and 200,000 people live with the results but have no input. That's not democracy. That is like a kingdom, only instead of it being in the society as a whole, we got the king inside the workplace telling us all what to do. We got rid of kings. We got rid of kings outside the enterprise. It's long overdue to get rid of them inside.
Yeah, it's like these incremental changes in the standpoint of the system, but nobody really kind of stands back and say, hey, is this fair? I mean, because you're right. All incentives in that process is for those 19 people to do and make decisions that are in their best interest.
Absolutely. That's why they're there.
Yeah. It would be weird otherwise. And yet when you kind of make that point, they're like, oh, how dare you? How dare you besmirch my reputation and say that I would, try to maximize my profit at the expense of all of these other people. They're shocked by it.
Which, by the way, is what they're paid to do.
It is what they're paid to do. Maximize their profit. That's their job.
That's the system. That's right. And if they didn't maximize the profit, the board of directors would fire the CEO. That happens from time to time. His job, occasionally it's a her, but his job is to maximize profit. That's the way the system works. But that's why the majority of people recently answered a questionnaire, I believe from the Federal Reserve, that if you had a sudden expense that you weren't prepared for $400, your car broke down or you had some illness, 40% of the American people said, I don't have $400. I would have to either eat less or move out of my apartment or sell something I own to cover a $400 sudden
expense.
And if you raised it, they asked, what about if it were $1,000? Then 2/3 of Americans could not come up with that money. At the same time, Mr. Bezos got his $150 billion. And let me remind everyone, if you have $150 billion, what you're mostly going to do is lend that to the United States government because that's the safest way to hold your money. They will pay you for that 3% a year interest. Let me just finish this with Jeff Bezos, if you don't mind.
No, you're fine. You're fine. Finish with Bezos.
If you have $150 billion and you lend it to the government, you buy treasury bonds, it's called. They will pay you 3%. Let's do the arithmetic. 3% of $150 billion, that's $4.5 billion a year that Uncle Sam sends you. Okay? This works out, but you're getting, ready? It's really important now, something on the order of $15 million of interest every day.
Wow.
7 days a week. You understand?
That's
Mr. Bezos does not buy lottery tickets because he doesn't need them. He wins the lottery every day in any case, and he doesn't have to shell out a buck for the lottery ticket. That's why he's becoming richer and richer and capitalism works this way. This man doesn't need $12, $15 million a day. Lots of Americans, the citizens he claims to feel some feeling for, they need it for their kids' education, for their health care, for their transportation, for decent housing, you name it. But he doesn't give it to them. And this system doesn't take it from him. It allows him, and by the way, he gets the $15 million a day, whether he does a lick of work or not. It's interest paid to him by Uncle Sam. And now the best part. Where does Uncle Sam get $15 million a day to give to the richest man on this planet? He gets it, Uncle Sam does, by taxing you and me. We pay extra for the gas in our car, for the alcohol in our beer, on our income tax. We pay extra to ship the taxes to Washington, which it turns around and pays out to Jeffrey Bezos to the tune of $15 million a day. The people that are watching this show, you've got to understand, you're being taken. You're being taken to the cleaners. You're being taken to the woodshed. You're being ripped off by a system that has long ago lost any claim to your loyalty or your support.
And by the way, last one, you still haven't answered. Was Trump the right answer?
Let's put it this way. I think Trump was the right answer in the sense that capitalism is in trouble. It isn't delivering the goods to the mass of people, and slowly and painfully, the mass of people are facing up to that stark reality. So they're scared. They're scared that as more and more people figure it out, partly because of programs like this one that talk about it honestly, they need to find somebody, some way to prevent the system from being pushed aside, the way slavery was, the way feudalism was, and so on. And they need someone to mobilize at least a part of the population to stand in the way of capitalism being pushed aside. When Mr. Trump is elected, that's his job. He promises them, I will take care of it. I'm not Mr. Nice Guy. I'm not going to try to keep I know the country's falling apart, but I'm going to create, at least among older, white, working people, a kind of core of folks who will stand in the way, who are going to support capitalism. Why? Because we're going to promise them how we're going to squash immigrants and how we're going to squash people on relief, and we're going to squash this one and squash that one and beat up on foreigners and whack the Chinese and all these other fantasies, most of which are fake. But it gets a certain part of the white working class to think that somehow he's going to save them. And so the deal is, you let us keep capitalism, we will at least provide you with symbolic theatrics that'll make you feel better, will allow you to entertain racism and anti-female and anti-immigrant and anti-Hispanic ideas and all the rest of it. That's the deal. And that's what Mr. Trump's function is. And believe me, if Mr. Trump were to disappear for any reason, they'd find someone else to play that role because they've got no other card to play.